In this tutorial, we're going to start with what appears to be a pretty decently colored image that doesn't really need any color correction, and we're going to use this as a springboard for moving forward and actually using the adjustment layers to make this into a much more surreal and bizarre scene, just to show you how you use the same tools that you use to make something look like it's supposed to and make it look like it's not supposed to. So we're going to start with this image and we're going to end with this image. And we're going to be using both masks and several of the other adjustment layers in order to do this. So to start with, we're going to look at the color balance adjustment layer. This adjustment layer it's probably one of the more complex one in terms of the number of settings you can change. So to start with, what it allows you to do is it allows you to adjust the amount of cyan, red, or magenta green, yellow, blue that exists in the image. And you can't just do it across the image as a whole. You do it for the midtones, the shadows, and the highlights. And you can set each of these independently. So just to screw stuff up really bad, I'm actually going to copy and paste what I've done before in here so you guys can look at those values and copy them down, because in the end it takes a lot of trial and error. What I really wanted to do with this, my goal is to get kind of soften the reds as much as possible, bring in more blues and more greens, right? So to start with, I'm going to pull in some more blue, because what I want in the end, right, with our end image here, which I'm not sure if I have, it's not fully done there, but I want it to look more like it's nighttime, right? This is a shot that was taken during the day, but I want it to look like it's nighttime. Now, if it was really to look like it was nighttime, it'd just be dark and you wouldn't see anything. But to get the idea of night, usually what happens with our eyes is, and then it's going to go really surreal, but what happens with our eyes is that we tend to see more desaturated colors, right? There's not as much color information because our eyes are switching into black and white mode, and everything tends to take on a blue cast. And so if you create an image that is still bright, but it's more blue in tone and desaturated some, you can give people the sense that it is nighttime. Even if there's some bright lights in the sky that, like, called the sun, that you can't get rid of it, maybe they'll think it's the moon. All right, so now I'm gonna pull some cyan in as well, and this is just in the midtones, and you'll already notice the greens are really starting to pop. I'm going to pull some green up too, right? And this is really making the greens sing. So I've started there in the midtones. Let's go into the shadows. I'm going to pull the shadows in a little bit, make it more blue. I'm going to, if I don't want to go to magenta, right? I want to pull this even maybe a little bit more towards green, but if I go too much, it's going to be washed out and just look really, really green. So you want to be careful with that. And then maybe a little more cyan here as well, right? That doesn't seem to be such a huge impact on the image. And then the highlights, things change really radically very quickly. And if I pull in some cyan, I can get this. If I uncheck preserve luminosity, it's really going to flatten the image, right? Which isn't exactly what we want. We want these highlights to be there. So I'm going to bring in a bit more blue in the highlights. You can see that's really starting to make a change in the back of the image. And I could even bring in more green, or maybe in the highlights I need magenta, right, to really cool off those green tones in the hills. Now what's nice about this is it really starts to highlight the fog in the background, while keeping these things blue. Okay, I have no idea if this is anywhere near close to what I did, but what you do is you essentially go through, and it's a long process. You go through and you go through each one until you get the effect that you want, and it takes a while to tweak all of that stuff. So I'm going to be lazy, and I'm going to grab the values from this other image. So I'm going to zoom in here so you guys can see this really quick, and then I'm going to copy and paste them all and then start the tutorial again. Okay, so for the midtones, you can pause it, take a look. Shadows and highlights. Okay, so now I've copied my last work, so this image looks somewhat like the example I showed you when we get done with it. And so you can see that I've cooled off a lot of the red tones. If we turn the visibility of this on and off, you can see that already the image is starkly different from where we started. And so we're on our way to turning this into more of a night scene. The next thing we need to do is we need to desaturate the color in the image some so that it appears more as though it's nighttime. And we can also we could actually make it all bluer as well if we wanted to. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the hue saturation, which is right next to color balance. We're going to add this layer. And you'll see that this has fewer options available to us. One of the ones that we're going to want to do is saturation. That's the primary one. This allows us to choose any color, right? We can recolor this to all sorts of craziness. To start with, we're not going to work with that because I want to show you how the saturation works. So if we start desaturating this color, right, this is going to bring this more towards what we see at night, right? We don't see colors as brightly. In fact, at some point, we cease seeing color entirely. And so by desaturating it, now it looks like it's a cloudy day, foggy day. It's starting to get closer to where we want it to go. I'm going to double check and make sure I have the settings somewhere right. All right, so I actually had this up a little bit higher at -56. Now, the lightness is essentially another way to control brightness, right? Like I can pull this down and it's going to darken the whole image and make it appear more like night. Now, if I go too far, I'm going to lose all of this information. The image is going to be way too dark, and that's not what we want, right? We only need like a, but if we make it way too light, you'll see that we get the other issue, right? And so what it does is it actually kind of compresses the brightness to dark, or the contrast window. In this case, I've set the lightness to -15 and the saturation to -56. Now, at this point, I want to show you the importance of order in the layers panel when you're working with adjustment layers. Right now, we've got this image that's starting to be desaturated. It still has, I would say, too much color, and it's not blue enough to really connote night. Like maybe this is starting to become twilight, but we're not quite there yet. Now, order is really important. So if we take this hue saturation channel and drag it down below color balance, we get a much different image, right? Now we have something where I'm actually really much happier by having the hue and saturation channel below the color balance channel, right? It's really starting to turn this image into something that looks more night-like, right? We're actually we're creating a blue cast over the entire image. Now there's one more thing that I might want to do to make this look even more like a night scene. And that is to add one more adjustment layer, and I want to make sure it's actually on top of the color balance. So I'm going to select color balance, and I'm going to go ahead and use exposure. Now exposure is a much more complex and touchy way to deal with the exposure of the image. It's actually much more accurate to how cameras function than just standard brightness contrast, and you can get a lot better results in some cases. Sometimes a little brightness and contrast is great, but exposure, you can see as I crank this up, just the exposure is really brightening it. Vice versa, I can also make it look completely underexposed, right? So I'm going to leave this set to 0 for now. The gamma correction really it kind of adjusts the center point or the gray point, right? It pulls in a lot more darks or whites, right? You can really make this much darker and creepier. Now, maybe we want the background to look like this. Maybe what we want is this dark blue purple sky because it is nighttime. We want the trees in the background to be eerie and creepy. And so I'm actually going to leave the gamma correction set to 0.37. Offset makes a huge difference too. We're not going to mess with that one now, but you should definitely adjust it in the future. Now, if I increase the exposure, we're going to get some really weird results. So we don't want to do that, right? So now we have this issue where our foreground, we want to be lighter, and really any of the plants down here, we would love to have them be lighter in color, but as things go up high, we'd like them to be to have this same darkness. And so we can do that by using the mask that comes attached to every adjustment layer that we make. And so for exposure, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use my gradient tool to draw a gradient. Now, we haven't used the gradient tool in Photoshop yet. It is similar to the gradient tool in Illustrator. However, once you've drawn a gradient, you can't modify it live. You have to make modifications and then redraw it. However, it does fill over the existing gradient fine, right? So if I click and drag, right, I can make a gradient, and you can see it more visibly here, right, where it's dark over there, and it's like, oops, I actually wanted to go maybe from the top up. Oh, that's better, right? So now I'm gonna go ahead and see if I can get this maybe a little bit higher up. Now with this, if I double click on this gradient here, I can actually open a similar editing panel, choose a variety of options, or adjust where these stops are, or add an additional stop in the middle. It's a little bit different than Illustrator's, but it's pretty similar. The ideas are the same, right? These are your opacity stops up here, and these are your color stops down here. And you can actually have the opacity and the color information change. The diamonds there's a different diamond for each. So that gives you a little bit more freedom than you have in Illustrator, right? But if I want this to be, maybe I want it to go dark really quickly, so that right when this seam happens here, I can get that set. In my case, I'm going to say I'm pretty happy with the way it is. And so what I'm going to do is, so I've got this set, but now these trees are much too dark. And because these are foreground elements, I really want them to still be illuminated, even though it's darker in the background. And so with this selected, right, I can use my eraser tool to come in here, and I can erase some of these options. Now I don't have the eraser tool selected. I'm going to select the brush tool because I'm actually going to be using the eraser on the back of my pen tool. So you guys would actually want to select the eraser. And if I do this, currently it's 175 pixels, 52% opacity, and that's exactly how I want it to be. So I'm going to come in here, and if I start erasing this, right, again, I'm at 50% opacity. I'm doing that for a reason, because I don't want too much of a highlight to be around the edge of this tree. I really want this stuff to come in here, right? And I may want some darkness to be up there at the top of the tree. Still, this one I probably don't, because it's the entire tree, right? I'm going to undo that last stroke because I went outside the borders of the tree. Now I could, if I was smart, I could actually define a selection area here and confine this so that I do get that nice hard edge and I don't go over the edge. But I'm just gonna, because I'm doing this quick, I'm not going to do that, although I would highly suggest that you do that when you're working on this stuff. And then I'm gonna come back in, I'm just gonna keep erasing one more time to make sure I get more or less this whole tree illuminated like I'd like it to be. And then I'm gonna come in here, I'm gonna do the same thing on this one. All right, so I can start to get this. Now I could even go into the, right, if there's any of the plants in the background that I wanted to illuminate more completely, I could do that. All right, in this case, I'm actually going to let this tree go a little bit darker at the top. And this branch is really dark, and I'd like to pull in some more color there. Ooh. But I don't want that to happen, right? Unless this tree is some sort of holy oak, so I'm going to shrink my brush size down. Get a little bit more color in there. I'm just going to keep going down here on this trunk there. I missed that spot there. Okay, so now minus the mistake I made up here, which I could correct, right? I could bring my paintbrush back in here and just come in and darken that area up again and do the same on the underside of the branch. Right, the underside doesn't really matter because it's already black. There's nothing more that's going to happen to that. Okay, so now I'm starting to get a much creepier image. I'm going to go ahead and maybe see if I can darken this in a little bit too while I'm at it. And this in as well, just because I can very, very quickly make that happen. Okay. And I do think that the way this image is made, these trees actually glow a little bit on their own. All right, so now I've got this thing set. So I have this nice dark sky by using a gradient, whereas I still have some color and enough detail in the foreground that the image isn't too washed out. Now I could put any sort of creepy, eerie horror film figure on in the foreground that I wanted to. I'm in a good place to do that. Now, the one last thing we can do to make this image even more surreal is if we grab our hue saturation and bring it back up above the color balance, and then tweak the hue here, right, and just crank it to one of these ends. It doesn't matter which because they wrap around, it's the same color. I mean, you can experiment with making it whatever color you want it to be, right? But in this case, I've got this thing set up so that it looks really, really dark. So now I've got this image in a surreal forest with weird orange haze and purple plant life. But it is a little dark, so I could add another exposure or brightness and contrast layer, and I can actually increase the exposure of the entire image a little bit. And then I probably want to increase the gamma correction just a touch, or maybe the offset needs to be just a little different. But you can see the offset, it doesn't take much for this thing to go crazy. All right, so I might actually set that back to 0. So now that I've done this, I have lost the blue in the sky. So if I want to get that back, I can go ahead and create another color balance layer. And I can just, in the highlights, right, I can really crank this up and make it blue. All right, and so I'm going to go ahead and do that all the way across the board. Just make it heinously blue. Right? And now this looks really awful. But because this does have a mask, I can come in with my gradient tool again, and I can stretch this up. I can see how that looks. Not so much. Maybe I want to come up here a little bit higher. And so now I am starting to bring that blue back in across the top. And again, there's no reason why I couldn't, and I think having some blue in the sky is actually really nice. There's no reason why I can't come in and do the exact same thing where I'm going to come in with my eraser and erase the blue off these trees so they still look like they're in the foreground. Right? And if I wanted to, I can leave by doing this at a lighter percentage, I can leave some off. But I'm just going to go ahead and quickly erase all of this blue. Right? Maybe there's a little bit of blue hanging out there. Okay, so now I've created this creepy, dark space for some horrible act to happen, or maybe there's something beautiful here. Who knows what it is? But what I'd like you guys to do is go ahead and experiment with this and continue to work with these tools. Maybe add something here and see if you can make it look like it's glowing. You can always use an exposure or other adjustment layer to come in and make these highlights brighter, right? Like make something look like the light is actually being cast on the objects around it. So if you put a figure here that you wanted to look like was glowing, you can make these highlights much brighter white with one more adjustment layer and using masks and your brush tools.